as we rightly should, most of us Christians concentrate mostly on the New Testament. We might have a few favorite things from the Old Testament, like the 23rd Psalm or a few passages from the book of Isaiah, but we don't use the Old Testament very much. But actually, the Old Testament has some very interesting things in it. And there is an idea that runs through the Old Testament that I find fascinating. That's what I'd like for us to talk today. It concerns about whether things go well in your life or whether things go bad. Now, in a nutshell, the idea is that if the presence of God is in your life, things will go well for you. If the presence of God is not in your life, things will not go well for you. Now, at first glance, it may seem that what this means is that God will reward you by giving you good things, or God will punish you by giving you bad things. And so we might look at it like as God paying you back, balancing the score, or whatever. But although parts of the Old Testament do actually contain that idea, the Old Testament contains a lot of other ideas, and the Old Testament just does not give us one idea. It gives many different ideas. And the reason for that is that in the Old Testament we find the Hebrew people and then the Jewish people struggling to make sense of things. They're struggling to make sense of why things happen as they do. Why do things happen like they do? That was their big question, and that's the big question the Old Testament tries to answer. And it never really does answer that. But it does let us see their struggle as they're trying to figure it out. The Old Testament lets us see a number of different ideas that the Hebrews and then the Jews came up with to explain why things happen the way they happen. And this is one of them. The way this particular idea is presented, it's like there seems to be a spiritual space, for lack of a better term, inside your life. And that spiritual space is always going to be filled with something. It's either going to be filled with God or it's going to be filled with evil. It'll never be empty. There'll always be something in it. And the way this works is, if God's not in there, evil will reside there. Always be something in it. If God's there, evil can't get in. If God's not in there, then evil will come in. And that's it. That's a very simple thing. However, the way it's presented in the Old Testament, I find very fascinating. It's not stated flat out. It's presented as an allegory. Now, an allegory simply means using symbolic imagery to express some kind of idea. And in this case, the allegory is expressed using the concept of God's face. I don't know if you've ever noticed that in the Old Testament or not, but the term the face of God, or God's face, occurs many times throughout the Old Testament. We heard it in our Old Testament reading, and we also heard it in our song. The face of God. Now, in this case, in the Old Testament, when it talks about the face of God, it's not talking about a face like this. The face of God is an allegory for God's presence. When God's face is turned toward you, you have God's presence in your spiritual space. When God's face is turned away from you, you do not. So, as an example of God's face being turned away from us, or turned away from someone, you can go back to what we heard for our Old Testament reading from the book of Leviticus, and there are things that God tells people not to do there, and God says, whoever does these things, I will set my face against him. Set my face against him. In other words, God is saying, I'm going to withdraw my presence. Another example of this comes near the book of Deuteronomy. You remember the Hebrews had wandered around in the Promised Land 40 years, and they were about to enter the Promised Land, as the book of Deuteronomy comes to a close, but Moses was dying, and God speaks to Moses and tells him how the Hebrews will finally enter the promised land, and God takes him up on a mountain and lets him see the promised land before he dies. And God says that once they're in the promised land, they may be tempted to worship other gods. And God says, if they do that, then I will hide my face from them. And that means that if they worship other gods, God's presence will leave them. And remember what happens if God's presence is not there. It's never a vacuum. Evil comes in. Another example comes from Psalm 34. It says, the face of the Lord is against those that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. For our Psalm 44, we heard, awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise, cast us not off forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? Now these are all examples of God's face being turned against or set against people. And remember, this happens when evil is in your spiritual space. When God's presence is not there, when God's face is set against you, there is evil in your spiritual space. Remember, evil cannot come in if God is there. Evil can only come in if God is not there. And the results of evil coming in are seen from the passage in Deuteronomy we just talked about. And it says that if the people go in the promised land and start worshiping other gods, God will hide his face from them, and they will be conquered by other people. And it says evils and troubles will fall upon them. So that's the result of not having God's presence. Evils and troubles will fall upon you. From Psalm 34, the result of having God's face set against someone is that they are cut off, as it puts it. From Psalm 44, the result of having God's face set against someone is affliction and oppression. You see, when God hides his face or withdraws his presence, it means evil comes in. And as a result, trouble, affliction, oppression come in. But on the other hand, if God's face is turned toward you, you are said to have God's presence. Psalm 80 says, turn to us again, O God, and cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved. If God's face shines upon you, you have God's presence in your spiritual space, and you are saved. Remember, the idea is that if God's presence is there, evil cannot come in. And thinking back to Psalm 34, it says, the face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. But then it goes on and says, the righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. So being delivered out of your troubles is the opposite of what happens if God's face is set against you. If God's face is shining on you or turned toward you, you are delivered from your troubles. God hears your cry, and God delivers you out of trouble. Now, in addition, in the Old Testament, to hearing the metaphors about the face of God, you may have read something about God's countenance. Now, countenance is a word we don't use much anymore, but it just means face. That's what it means. An example comes from Psalm 4. It says, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. Another example, it comes from Numbers 6. This is familiar to a lot of people. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Interestingly enough, if you go to the Greek, you'll see that there's not one word for face and one word for countenance. It's just literally the word for face. There is no separate word for countenance in there. It's just one word. But sometimes, depending on what Bible translation you use, some translators will translate sometimes as countenance, but it's actually the same word. In every place in the Old Testament where you see countenance, it's just face. I've heard people do entire lessons before on the difference between God's countenance and God's face. I guess they didn't know it was the same word in Greek. So in every place where you see the word countenance, it's really face. So the passage from Numbers that we just looked at literally says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face upon you and give you peace. That doesn't sound as poetic, but it's literally face. Now, interestingly, when this Greek word for face appears in some places in the Old Testament, some translators will actually use the word presence. Because remember, we said, that the Old Testament was using the face of God as a metaphor for the presence of God, and sometimes translators will actually put it as presence. An example of that comes in the book of Genesis. Remember, Cain kills his brother Abel, and God comes and confronts him about it. And God tells Cain that he is cursed from the earth, that he will be a fugitive and a vagabond for the rest of his life. And then many Bible translations will say, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod. Literally, though, that is, Cain went out from the face of God. The same is true with another passage that's familiar to a lot of people, Psalm 51. It says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your spirit of holiness from me. It's literally not cast me not away from your presence. It's cast me not away from your face. And so the translators are just recognizing that the Old Testament writers are using face as a metaphor for God's presence. So sometimes instead of putting face in there, they put presence. Now let's all look at Psalm 102. It says, hide not your face from me in the day of trouble. Incline your ear to me. In the day when I call, answer me. You see, when you think about that there, it's very obvious what the person is asking. Hide not your face from me. When I call, answer me. He's asking for God's presence. Another example is Psalm 27. It says, hide not your face from me. Put not your servant away in anger. You have been my help. Leave me not, neither forsake me, O God. And here, obviously, when the psalmist here is asking for the God not to hide his face from them, he's saying, leave me not, neither forsake me. So he's wanting God's presence here. Now, it's interesting to note that in all the occasions that we have seen where someone is asking God to shine his face on them, don't hide your face, lift up your countenance, or give us your presence. In all these situations, they're doing it because they're in some kind of trouble, and they're asking for God's help to get out of trouble. And if you'll look at these things in the Bible and just look at it, it's real interesting because they're not asking God to do anything. All they're asking for is God's presence. Because the idea is, you see, that's all that's required. It's not that God has to do anything. God just has to be there. And remember why? Because you can think of it as like a space in your life, a spiritual space. If God is there, evil can't get in there. And if evil is there and God comes in, evil leaves. So God doesn't have to do anything. All God has to do is be there. And simply as a result of having God's presence, you get out of trouble. You see, this idea in the Old Testament says that no bad, no trouble, and no evil can affect your life if God's presence is there. Because God's presence will drive all evil influences out. Now, I think this is an interesting idea from the Old Testament. That idea that there's a spiritual space inside you that will always be filled with something, either God or evil. If the presence of God is there, that's a presence of good. The presence of bad cannot be there. So bad things will not happen. But when God is not there, evil will move in. And that's a presence of bad. And bad things will happen. But be sure and realize this idea is not saying that God is the one that causes the bad things. Evil is causing the bad things. This idea only says that when God leaves, evil comes in. And that's when the bad things happen. And that's why we see so many times in the Old Testament where people ask God to turn his face to them. Where people ask God not to hide his face from them. What they're really asking for is God's presence. Now, of course, this brings up a lot of questions. What do you have to do to have God's presence with you? Well, I think Psalm 34 sort of speaks to that. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil. So obviously, if you do evil, you're not going to have God's presence with you. Now, there's a lot of other questions that this brings up too. Is having the presence of God some kind of magic wand so that nothing will ever go wrong in your life? What if sometimes things go well in your life and sometimes things don't? How do you interpret that? And what if things are going bad and you just can't figure out why you don't have the presence of God in your life? You know, I think if you start thinking about things like that, you can carry it so far that you just get mired up in a bunch of questions. And while I don't want to avoid these questions because they are reasonable questions, I think we need to look at this idea of God's presence in your life in light of what is happening in the overall Old Testament. And remember, in the Old Testament, what we see happening, the main theme of the Old Testament, what the Old Testament struggles with from one end to the other, is they're trying to make sense of things. They're trying to make sense of why things happen the way they do. They're trying to figure out, why did this happen? Why did that happen? That's what they're trying to make sense of. And we see all these different voices in the Old Testament trying to make sense out of that. So many different viewpoints in the Old Testament. And that's because they never figured it out. They were struggling to make sense of things. And the genius of the Old Testament is that the Old Testament lets us see their struggle. The Old Testament lets us see how they wrestled with these questions, these big questions. Why do things happen the way they do? And they wrestled with them for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years and never figured it out. What we've talked about today is one voice in the Old Testament that emerged when they were struggling with those questions. It's not the only voice there. So I think what we should do with this is look at it in an overall perspective and consider it as one viewpoint in the Old Testament, one viewpoint that while may not be the one final complete answer, is certainly something to consider. And I think that what we also should consider is asking for God's presence in our own lives.